Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here. Welcome to the Daily Evolver Live. It's Wednesday, November 1st, 2017. And today I wanted to talk about what happened yesterday in New York City, where 8 people were killed and several wounded by an ISIS sympathizer who drove a truck into a bike lane in downtown Manhattan. As an act of terror and as an act of obedience to ISIS, who has implored people like him to do just exactly that, especially now that they're losing on the battlefield or have lost. And of course, you're all plugged in to a 24/7 news cycle. I mean, we can watch this thing unfold in real time if you want. And so I'm not necessarily going to focus on the newsy specifics so much as the larger cultural forces and trends that are involved, which is the specialty of integral theory. And, you know, a lot of this I've talked about in many other episodes, just this dynamic of terror in the 21st century. And I probably go into more detail in past podcasts, but I'm getting a lot of new people, and I want to just lay out these sort of general principles. So I'll be sort of reviewing a bit in a certain way. One of the things that integral theory shows us as we look at this spiral of development, and we have our charts on Integral Life, and I have them on our website that lay this out. But we move from the archaic to the tribal and to the warrior stage and the traditional stage, and then the modern and postmodern and emergent integral stages. Those are that's sort of the general framework that we use in integral theory. And there are various phenomena that we see happening as we move into these higher stages, where we, in America, are generally at its center of gravity modern. And we see that there are cultures that are still pre-modern and even pre-traditional. And that we have a history that is stretched out over many different stages of development at the same time. And that's not true in earlier history, where everybody was tribal for a long time, many tens of thousands of years. And then everybody was warrior and everybody was traditional or maybe stretched out over 2 memes, but now so many. And that there is a particular sour spot on the spiral where people at a warrior stage of development who are really wired to fight. I mean, that's really the orienting principle of somebody at what we call the red stage of development. It's an egoic stage of development where you're trying to make your way. There's no real layers of civilization that have been laid down. And, today is a good day to die. And that is the credo of the warrior. And they are definitely willing to die. And they're not even so developed that they don't, they're basically just going to a happy hunting ground, which they can sort of feel their ancestors already. So it's not such a, shift for them in a way. So we have this, really violent stage of development, which is completely normal at that stage. And then we have the next one, which is the stage where people, that's just at some point becomes too chaotic and too violent, and people need to move forward. Humanity moves forward. And one of the ways we do it is by recognizing a transcendent God in the sky, or a transcendent state like nirvana, where everything's worked out, and that is now the new standard of justice. And we no longer have to have blood feuds, and we no longer, we civilize ourselves in obedience to that transcendent force. Now, there are people who have a foot in both camps. So they're warriors, but they're also holy. They're holy warriors. And this is a stage that is particularly dangerous because they are willing to die. They are perfectly happy, as this guy was, to go on to an eternal afterlife where he will be rewarded with, nice, cool grapes and lots of virgins. So, that is bad enough. But if you add the technology that you get in modernity, then you really have a problem. And that's what we've been seeing with these, with the rise of ISIS in general, and with terrorism in general in the 21st century. We have a pre-modern mentality wedded to modern weaponry. And these, of course, are weapons that they could have never created themselves because they don't have the technological know-how or any kind of technological or industrial base to make them. But you can hand a warrior a gun and he'll use it, or a bomb, or in the case yesterday, a truck. So modernity, this is one of the wicked problems of modernity. And it's particularly dangerous because, of course, first of all, we live in a free society. I mean, that's just an astonishing achievement of modernity, that people can come and go for the most part. And you don't have to check in, and you're allowed to leave your neighborhood. And you can. I mean, there's actually transportation. We mix with people from all over the world. I mean, I often think that the real headline every morning ought to be, and historically, this is is the surprise. Everybody in human history would be shocked to hear this headline, and that is that 7 billion people are living in peace. Now, we have 7.5 billion people on the planet, and so there are a few 100 million who are not. I mean, they're in hot wars, but that is a small and vanishingly small number of people by any historical standards. So we want to notice that too as integralists, so that we don't feel like this is something that is an existential threat to the society. It's clearly not, and we actually know this officially as of 2 weeks ago, when Raqqa fell, which was the last stronghold of ISIS in the Middle East. And ISIS as an army on a battlefield with territory is over. And that happened in about 3.5, 4 years, the rise of ISIS and the fall of ISIS. And it was preordained. I mean, there was no chance that a red army, even with modern weaponry, could defeat modernity, And I mean, of course, if you remember back then when ISIS was on the rise, people had real fear. And traditionalists here in America had a lot of extra fear. I mean, they thought, Sharia was coming to Kansas. But that, sort of lacks an understanding of the enormous power of modernity. I mean, they're fighting a force, especially if you think the American fighting force of highly trained soldiers using satellites. We could literally watch them from space. We control the money system. We control the communication system. We have drones. We have an air force. I mean, come on, what's really remarkable, and to modernity's credit, because modernity has a higher moral stage of development as well, is that we just didn't go and, mow them down, just bomb carpet bomb. That's what Trump said he wanted to do. And people were like, oh, you can't do that. Well, we did that 70 years ago in World War II. We did all kinds of that. We did a good bit of that in Vietnam, and that it's just completely off the table. And it is. And we fought them, in far less efficient ways because we couldn't handle the civilian casualties is the reason. That's, an enormous moral development that we also want to note as we, sort this out and try to contextualize it in a bigger picture. Um, Now, the big danger is of course, some weapon of mass destruction. With this guy yesterday, well, I'll read you something that Graham Wood wrote in The Atlantic, and he wrote this about an hour after, two, I guess, after the incident happened. And here's what he wrote. He said, "The identity of the alleged attacker, Sayfullo Saipov, has been known for only an hour as I write this. But as usual, the details strongly suggest that the man was a complete idiot. He had several models of truck-based terror from which to learn, including that of Mohammed, who I can't pronounce his last name, who killed 89 people in Nice on Bastille Day last year. The Islamic State even published a manual that specified the type of truck to rent and the type of area to attack for maximum infidel carnage. Saipov learned nothing from these horrific examples. He emerged from his pickup with what news accounts are describing as a, quote, fake gun in one of the most heavily policed areas of Manhattan. The police of the first precinct, quote, lit him up, a law enforcement official told the New York Times, and Saipov is now in custody. As we mourn the dead, we should keep in mind that this attack could have been much worse. It partially resembles Nice or the Berlin Christmas market attack, but it also resembles something more pathetic, a suicide by cop." So, it's just one of these strange human things to see this thing that happened and think it could have been worse, and to feel lucky that it wasn't me or it wasn't bigger. And this is, it's amazing to me when they were talking this morning that the mayor and the governor they were on, and it turns out that this is the biggest terrorist attack in New York City since 9/11. That's 16 years. And that's astonishing to me because it's not for lack of motivation on the part of people who would love to do this and much worse, that it hasn't happened. And, the law enforcement and, these people deserve a lot of credit. And I, am astonished at the effectiveness of being protected. As I was about to say, the big issue is the weapons of mass destruction, and that there's a more coordinated attack, like the ones we saw in France, where there's a whole team of people and they really know what they're doing and they kill hundreds of people, or the dirty bomb, or the chemical attack, or, God forbid, a nuclear bomb goes off. And that's a real danger. And I think there's a very reasonable chance that will happen, considering the number of people in the military in Pakistan who are guarding the nukes and who secretly would love to see the great Satan get his face blown off. And, that one I worry about. That I worry about. Now, is that an existential threat like it was in the 60s and 70s when the United States and the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear warheads trained on each other? No. It's not likely that they would do anything that would kill the planet like that would have. But one going off it would probably be something like what we've been talking about on this program for a while, particularly earlier this week when we were talking to Rob Smith about the pattern of growth that societies have, and that at some point there's generally some jarring event, and it's generally historically a war, where it just shakes people into a higher stage of development. And this, if that happened, it would precipitate a world really coming to grips with its vulnerabilities in that area. And I think it would ultimately be, it would have positive effects. But that's not how we want to do it. All right. So, modernity fights back in all these ways that, where we really can have some faith that we can live with the odds as we live with the odds every day when we get in a car or get in an airplane or whatever we do or get out of bed, that we're going to survive and it's going to be okay. And that's really, we want to make sure we appreciate that, because that is new in human history, where people could actually feel safe, let their kids go out, feel safe. And, for those of us for whom that's true, we need to pause and appreciate it. So all of that. And then the other thing that modernity does that we're seeing here in real time is we just learn and fight and have opinions and get in the arena with each other. And, as integralists, we want to notice that too. Notice that we belong in, some part of that spectrum of left and right. The left's having its response, the right's having its response. And that whole system is actually, as ugly as it actually is fruitful because people are duking it out. So we see in the Huffington Post, the headline, Trump floats sending NYC suspect to Gitmo, underlined with an exclamation point. So, they're keeping an eye on Trump. MSNBC, why extreme vetting cannot prevent low-tech terror attacks is their headline, at least when I looked. And, so that's the left sort of, rising up against any overreach by Trump or craziness by Trump. And then we have on the right, Breitbart. The headline is Allahu Akbar. And they have one of their specialties at Breitbart is showing the sort of green overreach of the liberal media and really doing a lot of gotcha with that. That's what, both sides do with each other, but they're doing it on the right. And they have a special bile over there at Breitbart for Jake Tapper. And so Jake Tapper, they have this loop of him where yesterday after the attack, he was talking about the reporter was reporting from the scene, and the reporter said that the trucker said Allah Akbar as he was jumping out of the truck and waving his guns. And so Tapper turns after the reporter does his thing and says, the Arabic chant Allah Akbar, God is great, sometimes said under the most beautiful of circumstances. But too often we hear it being said in moments like this. So they can't stand that he said that. And so they have this whole article. And here's how they end it. While those of us who once admired CNN's Jake Tapper as a rarity in the mainstream media, an honest and objective journalist, we've been shocked by his transformation into a dishonest, sanctimonious, left-wing virtue signaler. We assumed his lying and peacocking was in pursuit of the applause and fame he so transparently craves. His laughably bad ratings, though, appear to show that, like most people who sell their soul, Tapper was tricked by the devil. And so they go into all the ratings. And it turns out that he's third place after Fox and MSNBC, as a lot of CNN is. And it just shows how CNN still tries to straddle the middle. They've gone more left since Trump. But we don't want the middle. We get juiced up by our Fox or our MSNBC. And I notice it myself. I mean, after a hard day at work in the mines, do I want to come home and watch NPR or public radio or whatever? Or I want to watch Chris Matthews scream. There's something juicy about that, and so there we are, being human again. The other thing I wanted to say is I was going to read from Roger Simon, but I might let me just say that Roger Simon, he's a columnist who was pro-Trump before it was cool on the right to be pro-Trump. And he writes in PJ Media, which is a very conservative site. And he talked about the judges who banned who did Trump's travel ban, upended it, that they have blood on their robes, and that we need to have even more vetting. So that's the fight from the right. But he said something that was, I think, really helpful, and I'm happy that people on the right are reading this. He says, he was talking about the beliefs of Islam and the jihad thing. And he said, these beliefs explain why people like ex-Uber driver Saipov, who was this guy yesterday, can, as was reported, seem so friendly and pleasant, and then turn around and mow down as many people as he can in a jihadist orgy. He may be psychologically disturbed in our terms, but in his own, he's a believer. Yes. And his belief system could ultimately be a more powerful and enduring adversary than communism or Nazism, because it promises eternal life. This is why I've always thought calling jihadists cowards, as so many of our politicians do, is silly. They're more than willing to die. Indeed, they crave it. And then he goes on to say, extreme vetting will not stop this by itself. We must all now be obnoxious, politically incorrect busybodies and get in Islam's face, demanding reform in every way possible, economically, socially, theologically, and yes, militarily. If we don't, our children and their children and grandchildren will be dealing with the exact same madness and violence for the years to come. I'm not so sure. I mean, I guess that, our getting in their face is part of it, but in America, our Muslims are modern, I mean, they're completely civilized here, with, I suppose, some exceptions, like in most communities. But worldwide, yeah. And that's happening. You see it online. You see it. You hear. I just had a woman come back from the Middle East. She's from Lebanon. I'm trying to remember her name, but I was talking to her, and she was saying that just how impressed she was with the young people who are just so tired of this in the Middle East, and they talk to each other online. The online thing is really, part of the solution, also part of the problem. Because, again, modern technology in pre-modern hands. So you have some significant percentage of the world population. I mean, Ken Wilber and Don Beck say that 70% of the world population is traditionalist or earlier. So that's pre-modern, 70%. They can use modern technology, the internet, to find each other. And so you see with the pushback against the violent right here and Facebook and Twitter and so forth, that, it's modernity's internet. You can't use it for inciting violence. And we got to get our act together with that, in terms of radical Muslims and radicals all over the world, because they're, it's now like 2 billion cell phones, 7 billion people, and projected to be 5 or 6 billion cell phones in the next 5-6 years. I mean, that we got to get that act together. So anyway, some thoughts on this. There's more to say. I'm just going to stop there and take a breath and do another thing that Integral, calls us to do. And that is to, have some contact with the sadness, with the loss, with these, people from Argentina who are here to celebrate their 30-year reunion of going to high school together. And, they're killed. And, just the tragedy of this, the catastrophe of human history, and that is still with us. And, we want to have that online too, and say a prayer or whatever we think will help, make this right in the bigger world to come. So Corey, how you doing? What are you thinking these days about this?
Well, I guess first off, another tragedy, another episode.
Yeah.
This whole time, I'm just sort of thinking back over the years. How many of these episodes have we done? Have you done?
Many.
And I'm always sort of impressed that commentators like yourself are able to talk about this in sort of fresh ways every single time it happens. You'd think by now you guys would have a script that you just read off of every time this occurs, because it keeps happening. And it just makes me really grateful for you and your perspective, Jeff. I think you help us. You help us find the beautiful behind all the ugly. And that's really important. There was just a poll taken by the American Psychological Association. Let me read this. A recent poll published by the American Psychological Association finds that 59% of Americans surveyed think this is the lowest point in the nation's history that they can remember. Now, that's qualifier that they can remember.
Yeah, that is shocking, but not really.
Yeah. And that's sort of the thing. There's a disconnect between sort of the metrics of civilization and where we are. We are more peaceful. Gun violence continues to decline overall. The trends are positive. We enjoy, more times of peace than ever before in history. Yes. And yet there's this malaise, and none of those facts really can get at that malaise. They can't temper that malaise because, for a lot of people, this is sitting in their core. They're looking at, their cost of living increasing. They're looking at, these trends that are affecting people in a very personal way, not to mention sort of the nonstop barrage of, our amygdalas being hammered over and over and over again by the media, by the Trump administration, etc. Yeah. So it really, it feels like our shared lower left quadrant is sort of in tatters right now. And, particularly when tragedies like these continue to come down the line, we're still just getting over the Las Vegas shooting, and we should never be fully over any of these, right? I mean, they should always, that should be sort of a scab that really never closes for us. And yet we have no choice but to turn our attention to the next tragedy when it happens. And the last one is, sort of left to the wayside. And ultimately, it becomes very, very difficult to muster the political will amidst all that malaise to actually do something about it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, what I see as the most heartbreaking aspect of all these stories.
Yeah.
We feel the heartbreak. We share the heartbreak.
Yeah.
Cry together. We find ways to laugh together. But what we don't do together is find an actual way to solve these problems. And I don't care if those solutions are coming from the right or the left, preferably both, because they both have such vital aspects of this problem in mind. And they're,
Yeah.
But again, just to bring it back, it makes me grateful for this show as sort of a daily dose of optimism and, again, that beauty behind the ugly. Yeah. And I wanted to read just one quick comment that we received from yesterday's show that I think really drives this home. And that was from the Art of Being Unique But Not Special show. So someone wrote in our chat, Dan, his name is, I'm sorry, Will. Will wrote, just watched Jeff and Corey in The Art of Being Unique But Not Special, and it was exactly what I needed today. Loving your work. Such a relaxed and relatable show, and the mixture of quotes that Emerson quote is divine, multiple perspectives, Jeff and Corey, multimedia, and the grounding that an integral lens brings is just so juicy for me right now. So much gratitude to you guys. And again, I just, I'm not reading that just because, like we're oh so awesome or something like, but I genuinely believe that this daily dose of optimism and hope and forward thinking and sort of our attempt to we don't always get it right, but we
Right.
attempt every single time to find that simplicity on the other side of all of this complexity, just so we can exhale for a moment and
and relax.
And just
and appreciate
absolutely
what we have. Basically what I'm doing, and actually Ken pointed this out to me, and I hadn't really thought of it this way. He said, basically what you're doing is you're just taking these stories and showing the bigger, more historic context. And that's really true, because the bigger, more historic context is that things are getting better and better relentlessly. They are. Within that is the vicissitudes, or what is it, that word? But just the vicissitudes of life and death and tragedy and unfairness and, abhorrent things. And as long as they're happening at all, there's some part of us that it doesn't feel right to sit back and say, things are getting better. So you gotta, this is where multi-perspectivalism comes in handy. You got to have both, that 59% of the people think that this is the lowest point in the country's history. That needs to have a corrective.
Yeah. Well, they remember, that's the important part. So we can't count like Civil War or slavery or anything like that. So it's sort of within the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, that's always true too, because, we realized we survived the last 50 years. So it worked out. We don't know about this afternoon. Right. So anyway.
And Jeff, we do have a question from an attendee. Cool. It's an anonymous Q&A question, so I'll just read it out loud.
All right.
Do you believe the ideology or doctrine of Islam, in the example of Muhammad, promotes violence more than any other major religion?
That's such a good question.
And there's more. I believe that when combined with tribalism and lower levels of altitude, the doctrine of Islam is worse. For example, Nigeria is half Muslim, half Christian. Same levels of development, socioeconomic, political circumstances, etc. Yet the Muslims produce Boko Haram, the ISIS of Africa, and the Christians don't have one. There's also evidence that there are people who are well-integrated professionals brought up in modernized countries like Europe and North America, but still join ISIS only based on Islamic doctrine. In other words, perhaps sometimes ideology trumps development. As Sam Harris says, many believe that ISIS is acting like a bug light for psychopaths, but the evidence is contrary. I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks. Can of worms.
Yeah, well, that's such a good question, and I feel like I learned something from the content of the question. I don't know the answer to that. I have heard, Sam Harris make his case that it actually is objectively worse, and I've seen these arguments on Reddit where there's all the scripture that is about killing the infidel and crushing their children on the rocks. There's a few verses like that in the Old Testament of the Bible too, and then we see the Buddhists in Myanmar who are throwing babies on fires. So I don't think that it's probably one or the other. And I certainly don't have any moral case in believing that Islam isn't doctrinally more violent. I mean, it might be. So I appreciate the question. I appreciate the thinking behind the question, and I want to learn more about that myself.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really does sort of get to the heart of things, And to me, it almost depends on the Christian, right? I mean, is the Quran more violent than the New Testament? Yeah, it definitely is. Is it more violent than the Old Testament? I don't know, man.
That Old Testament's pretty hairy.
God was
pretty gnarly.
Yeah, God was a threat. I mean, there's recipes for rape and genocide, and I mean, there's a recipe for abortion in the Old Testament, which I always thought was kind of funny. So it's a tough thing, and my sense is, Jeff, I love the points that you were hitting earlier about does Islam sort of need to go through this Reformation stage? And I think most of us agree, yeah, absolutely it does. Yeah. And I think one of the major problems is, we were talking the other day about phases and how all, so we have states, we have stages, we have lines, types, all that. what we don't often talk about are phases. And I think that there is a type of phase language that's useful to look at in terms of, in this case, sort of the evolution of a religion, sort of within a society or a culture. And, Christianity was able to go through its Reformation at a time when, we were still largely running off of, we had sort of orange ideas emerging, coming into existence, but the technological base, the religious base, the political base was all still very amber. So that, in a certain kind of way, afforded a little bit more space for, these societies and these religions to sort of organically go through what they were going through, because there was no threat that some Christian over there would find a nuclear weapon that would destroy everyone, not just, sort of.
But they sure killed each other a lot.
They absolutely did.
And the percentage of people who have died from religious violence in the 20th and 21st century is a infinitesimal fraction of the number who died in the Middle Ages of religiously oriented violence.
That's right. Because religions that exist in any society that has, at orange level secular laws, infrastructure, scaffolding, tends to do much better at the modernization game than any religion that's left in sort of the vacuum of pre-rational structures and all of that. And, I think there's a case to be made that Islam has been trying, in a certain sense, to move through these same organic phases that Christianity did hundreds of years ago. The problem is it's taking place in a modern geopolitical context where we have nations like America who are actually, in a lot of ways, preventing the bloodshed that would occur in that Islamic civil war if it was, if we were just to let it unfold. Well, that would probably bring about some sort of reformation on the other side of all that bloodshed. The problem is we can't really, the modern nations can't allow that to happen because there's too much at stake in today's world.
Yeah, and also we can't watch.
Yeah,
it's too ugly.
Yeah.
And that's good. That's moral development. And also, as you said, we're so intertwined that it actually is not in anybody's interests except the fanatics.
That's right.
So we don't want to let that happen.
Yeah, it's the ironic thing. These modern systems are actually preventing in a lot of ways preventing the natural organic emergence of these traditional systems, and by wedging modernism in between these two tribal and sort of ethnocentric sects, modernism becomes that much more the enemy. That's sort of the funny thing about it.
That's the enemy of both of them. But I'm not sure that it's not I think it's clearly the better way to go. I mean, let's keep the children pacified so they don't kill each other while they grow up. I mean, that's what any good parent would do, and we're sort of in that position. And we can see that they're still fighting. I mean, if you look at the Muslims versus the ex-Muslims on Reddit and how they fight, it's. I mean, again, this is the younger generation. Let them fight there. And, we'll do our best to sort of keep it from completely blowing up. Yep. But, we all learn something. We talk about how modernity learns. I mean, my goodness, what we know about how to deal with this situation now versus in 2000, 2003, before we invaded Iraq and brought down Saddam Hussein. I mean, the thinking there was, even among reasonable people, what could be worse than Saddam Hussein? Well, we found out what's worse than Saddam Hussein, and that's, tribal fighting in a chaotic red situation where all of a sudden the authoritarian lid is taken off violently. And, it's not like they were waving roses in the streets.
That's right.
So that we learned that. Now, unfortunately, we're dealing with the fallout of that. And that, the dominoes have fallen, and it's still, continuing. But that's just the stage of development too, where these tribal cultures get sort of dominated by a mafia red level dictator like Saddam Hussein. And the one thing they can do is they can keep order. Yep. It's not pretty, but they can keep order. And that's sort of freezes these cultures in amber a little bit, in terms of there's a whole ocean of red amber traditionalists there who are kept in control. And then when the lid's taken off, they go for it.
That's right.
And so we learned that. So, we learned there is something worse than authoritarian, and that sometimes authoritarianism is a stage on the path.
That's right. You're making an evolutionary case for authoritarianism in these societies that are sort of in this mode of transition, and when they're dealing with a lot of red tribalism, power tribalism, it's such a critical. Now, obviously, authoritarianism gets rejected in any modern or postmodern system because, of course, it does. You're transplanting a bad organ, and the body politic is going to reject it. But
we're having a real we're having a real moment of experimenting with that here in the United States, because we got us an authoritarian.
Yep.
I mean, he's just he would love to be, I don't know about Saddam Hussein, but he'd like to be Erdogan.
He'd love to be Putin.
He'd love to be Putin. Thank you. And we're going to see if we're going to let him. I don't think so.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah. All right, my friend.
Another day, and
another story, and another way to look at things. So appreciate your being with me and everybody listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Jeff. See you tomorrow, buddy.
Thanks, folks. Bye.